welcome everyone to this Anglo-Turkish Society event on Halide Edib. My name is Michael Tatis. I'm going to be your chair this evening. I'm replacing the usual chair, David Shankland, I believe, and it's an honour to do so. I am a research associate at the London School of Economics. I've just finished a PhD there, studying Izmir, and I'm now writing a book about the history of Izmir. So that's.
I'm born in it.
Oh, fantastic!
Oh, yes. İzmirli.
Fantastic, fantastic.
İçinden mi?
Tabii.
Tamam.
Tam ortasında.
Maşallah biz Tireliyiz.
Merkezden.
And I'm the third person from the region. I think I'm from Sakızadası, so from here. Anyway, that's enough about me. I'm here to introduce Nagihan Haliloğlu, who's going to be conducting this really interesting talk on Halide Edib, who is of course the great Turkish political activist, novelist, feminist, and somebody who's had plenty of encounters with the English, as you're going to describe today, Nagihan. So I'm not going to say very much more. I'm going to allow you to take the floor and do your presentation. There's going to be a question and answer session afterwards. And we have lots of people in the audience on Zoom as well. So if you have questions at the end on Zoom, I'll prompt you. We have a good few people in the room as well. I think without further ado, let's pass on to you, Nagihan, and get started.
Okay. Thanks for coming, everyone. So yes, as Michael was saying, Halide Edib is a very sort of versatile figure and always super exciting and interesting to talk about her. Let's see if this, yes. So this is, this presentation is based on an article. Actually, it was first a presentation, then an article, and now it's a presentation again. So I've been working on Halide for a bit. I teach her in my courses. I teach at Boğaziçi University at the Western Languages Department. And I myself have studied in England, so it was really interesting to find that Halide was also here, and then of course quite interesting to find that she had actually stayed in Hampstead. So just a very kind of brief introduction to who Halide is. You can see her here with Atatürk, of course, possibly on their way, well, she is on her way to Ankara. So I divided her life into four, of course, these are sort of overlapping in some senses. So she starts off life as an Ottoman, and she's one of these figures, and we have a couple of, well, a number of them, who started their life, also their writing life in the Ottoman Empire, and then continued into the Republic. So I call the first period the Cosmopolitan Ottoman, because I mean, she was educated in the American school in Üsküdar. So she, from a young age, she had connections to the Americans, and through her teachers, she also had connections to sort of intellectuals in the United States as well, but also, as we shall see later, she had an English nanny. So her bringing up, and of course at the time, Üsküdar, where she was brought up, was a very multicultural space. So it was a very kind of cosmopolitan sort of growing up. And then, of course, 1920, the British occupation of Istanbul, and we had a lovely sort of presentation on this here a couple of weeks ago, I think, of Daniel. And then she goes to Ankara, as we can see here, and she becomes one of the sort of founding mothers of the Republic, I say. And because of her sort of language abilities, she almost is, well, she's recognized, let's say, as the founder of Anadolu News Agency, because she was writing about what was happening in the war. And then she famously has a falling out with Atatürk. And then that's when she actually comes to London. And then but she doesn't just stay in London. She first spends some time in Paris, and then spends some time in London, and from London she takes off to the US. She even goes to India. So she's kind of moving around. And then after the death of Atatürk, she goes back to Istanbul, and then founds the English literature department in Istanbul University, but also with her students, she translates Shakespeare into Turkish. And I still haven't, I mean, I think I have her Othello. I still haven't read it. I want to check like what her I mean, that would be an article on its own to see what kind of choices she makes as she's translating Shakespeare. Yeah. So this is these are some of her selected works, and when you're talking about Halide, it's always very interesting or complicated because some of her books she first wrote in English and then translated them into Turkish, and some first in Turkish and translated them into English. And this is a beautiful. So these are from all archive.org. I love using it, and it's so interesting to find that Halide has a really sort of presence in the archive.org website. So Ateşten Gömlek, as you can see, translated as the shirt of flame here, but also the daughter of Smyrna here. It's a very interesting publication history. I think I'll come to that later, but this one's published in New York and this one's published in Lahore. And of course, her connection to India is also very strong. And here, a film I haven't seen. So it's a film, very early film, made of Ateşten Gömlek. So these are the ones actually, these ones I've chosen. I mean, she's written many more novels in particular. So this is the only novel here, and these are all memoirs. These two are memoirs, and this is sort of collection of essays, and this is a travelogue. Yes, let's move on. Right, so I guess this talk or this article that I've written has many starting points, but one of them is an interview she gives to the New York Times. She seems to have been a darling of the New York Times, very interestingly. And these are all articles you can easily access when you kind of punch it into Google. So I'm sorry, there'll be lots of text, but I think they're so good that I want to read them aloud. And this one in particular really kind of encapsulates and summarizes her relationship to England. So this is New York Times, 1928. And so Claire Price is visiting her in London, I think, yes. So Halide Edib's other son is now at the School of Economics in London, where his mother has been living since 1924. An exile among the same British whose soldiers hunted her in 1920. I mean, this is basically the summary of this talk. So she was running away from the British, and then she came and sort of sought refuge with the British. As she escaped from Constantinople, hid her under charcoal bags on an ox cart guided by Anatolian irregulars. A few days before she left for New York, a visitor saw her in her flat in Hampstead section of London. Instead, and again, this is also quite important, instead of the traditional texts from the Quran, embroiderings in gold thread on green velvet, there was such sound of Victorian pictures on her walls as adorn thousands of other London flats. And of course, this is testimony to her very kind of Anglo-Saxon upbringing. So she's already conversant in this kind of Victorian sort of bits and pieces in the flat. So instead of the Turkish coffee and sweets, which form part of the refreshment usually offered to visitors in Turkey, there were tea and toasted scones. And yeah, it really just kind of encapsulates. And then when I read this, that I really wanted to know more about her time in England. And it's very interesting that she hasn't really written about sort of her own personal experiences. We'll come to that in 1930s. She wrote a series of columns called England and the English, but they're kind of more kind of cultural history, general observation, rather than what she herself felt about living in London. And her history with England and the English, it's kind of spread through different books. And so this one is from Introduction to Inside India. And it's so interesting, and I'll come to that also as well, that her relationship to England seems almost always to be somehow connected to India as well. So there's this kind of like Turkish, Indian, English complex through her life. So she's talking about, you know, actually, this is Introduction to Inside India, so she's actually talking about what she knew about India before visiting India. And first she says, you know, there were some stories like fairy tales that she heard from her grandmother. And then next came the English governess who told me about the India of 40 years ago. So this would be the colonial period. She had been the wife of an English tea planter and spent 30 years of her life in the country. India had become the playground of an imperialist race. They ruled as Olympian gods. And it's very, you know, her English always kind of, I find very striking because the metaphors she uses, I mean, I cannot imagine other Turkish writers, or not very many, that would use the metaphor of Olympian gods. So she has this kind of very kind of classic, and it's very interesting to see whether, I mean, of course, these metaphors should be in the arsenal of Turks because, I mean, yes, we're in the same area, but I have a feeling that she got this kind of classical metaphors through her Anglo-Saxon education, a kind of roundabout way. So they rode elephants, they hunted tigers and all the wild beasts of the jungle. The humblest among them loomed across the scene as all-powerful as a Genghis Khan. The white man, according to my governess, had extraordinary backbone. So you get the irony there as well. And then it's very interesting. So, I mean, of course, Inside India is written much later than Ateşten Gömlek, but I mean, Shirt of Flame. But in Shirt of Flame, there's kind of this villain, the English villain, who's portrayed not so much as, you know, he's a journalist, and maybe not so much as a present day villain, but sort of harking back to these imperialist modes of looking at sort of the Eastern races. Right. So yes, as we were saying a bit earlier, so the first trip to London was in 1909, and I got this, this is, I think, around that time, London High Street. So she was in Egypt when she was invited to London because of the 31st March events, which is, I mean, the very, yani interaction, it's kind of 31 Mart vakası, where the reactionaries, let's say, demonstrated in the streets. And of course, Halide Edib, as an educated woman, was seen as one of the sort of figures that the 31st of March protesters didn't like. Okay, I mean, I don't know the history all that well, so I'm sure there's lots done anyway, but she had to flee as this kind of liberal character. So she had to go to Egypt, and then she was invited by Isabel Fry. So apparently, I mean, this, I also find this very interesting. She had been corresponding with magazines in London because, I mean, I think she got this from her father, who apparently used to subscribe to a lot of English magazines, and she was, and particularly educational magazines, in which at the time there were all these kind of new methods of rearing children, and girls should be sort of educated like the boys. And apparently she grew up as a tomboy and she didn't wear dresses, and so she has this connection with, you know, the literary world outside of Istanbul, and then so she gets invited. And again, when she's in London, she writes these two novels. And it's so interesting, you don't really find descriptions of London in these novels. There's a bit in Handan, but these are, I mean, this is the period in which her marriage was falling apart. She was married to her maths teacher, whom she was very much in love with, but then he decided to marry another woman. So, and then of course, Halide couldn't take it. So this is, yeah.
What year she came to London again?
1909.
Yeah,
That's the first time she came, and then and then she came again in the 1920s. Yeah, right. So she goes back to Istanbul, and 1918 happens. The occupation of Istanbul happens, and then this is the famous scene. I just love this photograph of this woman speaking to all these men, and with all these fezzes. So she, I mean, this march was organized after the Greek army came to Izmir. And so interesting because, I mean, Istanbul is already under occupation, but the real kind of uprising or the start of the resistance is when Izmir is occupied. So that's like the red line. Izmir is our red line. So that's where everybody's galvanized. And in this crowd, apparently, there's also Nazım Hikmet. So it's, you know, everybody was there. And again, so I'm gonna, so this is from the Turkish Ordeal to sort of give a sense of what Halide Edib and her second husband, Adnan Adıvar, were feeling at the time. And of course, the British closed the parliament and many MPs were sent to Malta. Halide Edib wants to go to Ankara. Adnan wants to stay in Istanbul. She wants to go to Ankara and join Atatürk's forces. And then this is Adnan speaking. So Adnan says, haven't you yourself been urging that the peoples are our friends and governments are enemies? And this was her slogan when she was speaking at this meeting. So let the peoples, let the English people see to it that their government, the oldest parliamentary government in existence, and again, when she's writing her columns about England, I mean, she has a whole, I think even 2 articles on the parliament and the political parties in the UK. So it does not do injustice to a representative institution. And then again, this metaphors that she talks, so I suddenly had a vision of old Roman senators sitting tight in their seats while Rome was being taken by strangers. So she's saying, you know, I'm not going to stay in Istanbul as the enemy comes, I'm going to do something about it. But again, this Roman, this kind of classical metaphor comes in. And then we move on to her becoming famous as this female figure. This is probably the first time she appears in the New York Times. And again, very kind of succinct. So Turkey's fiery Joan of Arc, her double role as leader, pen and gun, her weapons. By the way, she writes Shirt of Flame. We'll come to that, but as she is in Ankara, it's serialized in the newspaper. Okay, stirs up people through novels and at mass meetings, expert shot and rider, and that's her father coming in there because she was raised as this kind of tomboy. How Halide Hanım escaped from Constantinople and joined army in Anatolia, back into politics again. Okay, right, so let's talk about Shirt of Flame. Can you read OpenScript?
Yes.
Good. If you're going to do a history of Izmir, this is what I do in my classes. Whenever the Ottoman comes, kids, can you read? But it's a brilliant cover.
We passed.
Yes.
Will I be tested as well?
Yes. After this, there will be questions.
Okay. Always up for that.
Great. So yeah, as you can see, this woman in flames. So it's about Ayşe, who's kind of more or less standing for Halide Edib. She's an Izmir evacuee. So the Greeks have come to Izmir and she has lost her family and has come to Istanbul. And she's like a mouthpiece for all the people who have lost their livelihoods and everything in Izmir. And it's interesting that the novel opens with a scene in which the English are bombing Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Istanbul. And it's I mean, from sort of stylistic point of view, interesting as well, because Sultanahmet meeting happens in the novel. And then it's the same slogan. Of course, Halide Edib is not mentioned by name, but it would be like very kind of metafictional if Halide Edib was mentioning Halide Edib's rally in Istanbul. Right, so again, this colonial despot, harking back to the English nanny that she is describing, this imperialist. But I would be amiss if I don't mention the mention of Ali Kemal Bey, of course, who gets a mention. So the hostess, so she basically, Ayşe is going through these salons in Istanbul, talking about what happened in Izmir. And one of the hostesses is described as trying to live by the edicts of Ali Kemal Bey, who, of course, is blaming the Union, God, İttihat ve Terakki, the Union and Progress party. And he's trying to be friendly with the English. So tries to recruit Aisha to the cause of explaining ourselves to the British. And then there's this description of British journalist called Mr. Cook, and of course Cook is a very kind of colonial surname. I still remember it with pain and revulsion. He sits there as if he is the only person in the room. So she really seems to be talking back to her English nanny, who was praising this kind of colonial officer. You could make out the shapes of his long skeletal legs under his trousers, and he kept shaking his long feet. His head with thinning hair looked like an old bird of prey that had lost his feathers. His big nose was aggressive and in the air, small blue eyes gazing around him without feeling. Arrogant, full of himself, mocking his victory gone to his head, he was the lowliest and most ignorant embodiment of the colonial despot of the English, who treads mercilessly on the people of the country, whom he calls the natives of the colonies. So all of a sudden, of course, I mean, the British approach wasn't like a colonial approach, really. In Istanbul. I mean, you could, of course, debate that, but having read about India and having heard about India from the nanny, I think she seems to identify with India quite a lot. So I find that really interesting. And it's also interesting, I mean, this is, of course, not a very nice picture that she paints of this journalist, but okay, we have to remember that this is being written as fighting is going on in Anatolia. And then when we actually get to her memoirs, The Turkish Ordeal, we find, as we shall see, maybe a more sympathetic picture. Yes, right, India. And of course, Mr. Cook is described as speaking very bad French. And of course, in Istanbul, everybody speaks perfect French. The Ottomans did anyway. Yes. This is again Mr. Cook he's saying this in bad French. Yes, you must want English protection, all of you. Look at India. And again, this emphasis on India. How happy she is. They thank God and pray for the continuance of white man's rule over them. But I do not know if England will accept this difficult task. Is there any way out for you? We have to remember the 60,000 Englishmen you killed in Çanakkale. If you repent sincerely, maybe England will forgive. Okay. Yes. So I was showing these two different publications of Shirt of Flame, this novel. So one of them in English in New York, and the other one is Lahore. And it's a very interesting artifact because, anyway, I'm not going to go up to that slide, but there is no date, and a physical copy of the book also exists in Boğaziçi Library, and it says 1940, and then there's a question mark. We don't quite know. It must be in the 40s, and it's called a rendering of the novel. So it seems like the Indians very quickly translated it. So, but they couldn't call it a translation because it wasn't a real translation. So it was more like they read it and then wrote it in English, more like so. So again, that's another task. You know, you could look at that sort of rendering and see how much it agrees with the actual text. But the importance of the Shirt of Flame, and to show that, you know, let's say Halide Edib's feelings were reciprocated with sort of by India, is that, you know, they really take it to heart. And again, I mean, we also in Turkey have grown up with the knowledge that the Indians were really supporting Turkey in the War of Independence. There are all these stories about, you know, Indian women giving away their gold bracelets and all that kind of stuff because the Turks were fighting the British. Anyway, so the book, yes?
Sorry, is there a Turkish version of this book?
Ateşten Gömlek.
Hayır, Doctor of Zimina.
Aynı kitap.
It's the same book.
It's the same book.
Okay.
And I think that's why,
Okay.
exactly, and I think that's why they renamed it, because it wasn't like a one-to-one.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, and this is the introduction. So needless to add, so this is the Indian introduction. Needless to add that I venture to present to the public this English version, so not a translation, of the patriotic fervour, sufferings and sacrifices of our Turkish brothers and sisters in the cause of national freedom and national honour, in the hope that it may kindle something of the noble spark in the bosoms of the sons and daughters of India, which is just now passing through the travail of rebirth. Right. Yes, so, and going back to Mr. Cook and how bad he's represented, and then this is kind of a more sympathetic description as she's fleeing from Istanbul to Ankara. And this is from her memoir. So the novel is written in 1922. So 6 years later, she has a bit more sympathy. So she's describing the English soldier. One English soldier stood under a big tree, scanning the road, his face very tired. Behind him, on a little raised earth terrace, were 3 others. They were flashing signals with a heliograph. I leaned out of the carriage and watched them with interest. The men on the road aroused my pity. How pale and yellow and miserable he looked. Surely the poor fellow must have had malaria. I had no ill feeling, no grudge against him. If I was a victim in the form of a hunted fox, the poor thing was a victim in the form of a persecutor who evidently didn't enjoy his job. How he must have longed to be home. Right. So there's all these. Okay, so she has sympathy, of course, for the simple soldier, but so that the officers are still sort of the villains in a way. So this is again from the Turkish Ordeal, describing the occupation. So the requisitioning of the houses, the throwing out of inhabitants without allowing them to take their personal belongings. Those were the mildest forms of bad treatment. I confess I felt embarrassed, for I had decided to have nothing to do with the English authorities, and I knew that they hated me like poison. But I decided with some difficulty to go and see Colonel Hivkat Smythe in Rumelihisar. The moment for a milder and more humane British attitude toward the Turks had passed since I had seen Colonel Hivkat Smythe last. The British headquarters was actually wishing for a violent and bloody fray between the Turks and the Christians, according to those reports. And so, of course, it was to their advantage to let us throttle each other so that they could be given a pretext to occupy Istanbul in the name of peace. So this is the classical, and again, again, in Turkish parlance, the British divide and rule position that she's trying to kind of highlight here. Right, so after bad-mouthing the English, then you will ask, why was she writing in English? But I mean, it was her sort of way of getting her story out into the world. And again, so this is why she says she's writing in English. So I will try to tell the story of Turkey as simply and honestly as a child, that the world might someday read it, not as a historical record, nor as a political treatise, but as a human document about men and women alive during my own lifetime. And I would write it in a language far better fitted to reach the world than my own. So, I mean, she's sort of emphasizing the reach of the language. It was that very night, so they have a sort of like a quarrel, an argument with Mustafa Kemal. It was that very night, as I lay in bed after the scene with Mustafa Kemal Pasha, that I determined to write my memoirs and to write them in English. The independent Turkish nation will share its ordeal with many independent nations of the world. So again, signaling to India, I would say.
What was the root of their disagreement?
Their disagreement, because I mean, even in the Turkish ordeal, I mean, she is just kind of glossing it over. She doesn't give the details, but that he was being very autocratic and not listening to people around him, and then shutting her up. And then, of course, the way she's been raised, she just can't handle that, and so they fall out. But then again, of course, when also Atatürk writes, or rather does the nutuk and his address, of course, he is blaming her for wanting an American sort of, what do you call, like a mandate in Istanbul. So that's her, according to Atatürk, that's her kind of crime. And of course, Halide herself is saying, this was the American mandate was one of the things that all the MPs in Ankara were discussing. It wasn't just Halide Edib herself, but it was just one of the things that were on the table. And because she had this American education, it was kind of like on her that she seemed to be like the one that was propagating that idea.
She depended. She believed it. It was the time.
Yes.
That time. Yeah, that was the time.
Yeah. Right. Yes. So okay. Again, it's kind of glossed over, but let's read what Toynbee has to say about this rift. It's a very I haven't written my bibliography here, but it's this really curious book that Toynbee has written about people he's known. Halide is one, and in the same book we have T. Lawrence as well. So he knew everyone who was anyone. So it's a really interesting book to read. So, so Atatürk had succumbed to a dictator's occupational infirmity of being unable to cooperate with his equals. And again, this idea that Halide Edib really saw herself as an equal to Atatürk. I mean, of course, at the time, he wasn't Atatürk, he was still Mustafa Kemal Pasha. It's very strange looking back now that she saw herself like as equal, but at the time, people did see themselves as equal to Mustafa Kemal Pasha. And the exiles were paying the price for this. Each of them had as good a right as Dante had to sign himself exile emeritus. Atatürk was flagrantly at fault, but he was still the savior of his and his victims' country. In this difficult moral situation, my Turkish friends in exile showed good judgment and admirable generosity. And this is very true. Again, I find it super interesting that when she's having these, maybe it'll come later probably, interviews with the New York Times, it's really very New York Times still. That's what they do with the Turkish office. You know, they're trying to make the office say something against the government. I mean, the questions are leading there. But Halide is very kind of like, no, you know, you may be autocratic, but that's, you know, Atatürk is what we needed at the time. So she's very, very calm about this. And that's why he's saying, like, she's being very generous. It's a very good Turkish saying, you know, kol kırılır, yen içinde kalır. So yeah, she's a really kind of good demonstration of that. So their comments on Atatürk's acts were frank, but discriminating and objective. Okay. Right, and then we move to Hampstead, you know, after she has the rift, she comes here. And these page numbers are from the İpek Çalışlar biography, which I would recommend to anyone who is interested in Halide. Wonderful, wonderful biography. And this is a letter that she has found, writing to American friend Florence Billings. Apparently, I'm not quite sure what Florence Billings was doing, but she was also a scholar and she wanted to come to the British Library to do some research on the Near East question. And she's and Halide is in this letter kind of inviting her to come, which she's kind of showing Turkish hospitality, if you like. So I live in Hampstead in a semi-ground floor apartment. So this is where we need to get to Blue Plaque, basically. The rooms at the back have a magnificent view. There's a lake, there are trees. When the sun sets, the towers behind the trees look like minarets, and the swans of the Queen make funny circles in its dark shadows. And again, I think she's also being, again, very generous. And she doesn't say like, oh, I miss Istanbul so much, or, you know, this is a very strange land. I think she has this ability, again, from her cosmopolitanism, that she sees towers and she kind of identifies them with minarets. I mean, she is very much able to kind of incorporate what she sees around her into her own sensibility. I think it's a very great ability. So if you should want to stay with us, I even have a small room that looks over to the lake that I can turn into a bedroom for you. In this place where those who are called the Parliament Gang were burnt, Adnan's soul too is burning in fire. So Adnan was an MP and he had to flee. And again, she's very interested in the history of the British Parliament, and she seems to have been reading upon it as well. So she knows about, I now forget, I guess, some people were burned in Hampstead. Right. So they had friends, other people, and again, this is from the Çalışlar biography. So Rauf Orbay, who was also general, and I think he was the one who went to sign the Mudros treaty. So they spent time together, and this is his description. Again, İpek Çalışlar also has to resort to other people's memoirs because Halide just doesn't write about it. So this is how he describes their time. We had all known the difficulties of the World War and struggle for independence. We did not think of anything of having to go with one meal a day. Thankfully, none of us had addictions such as smoking, alcohol, or fashion. I did not want to disturb them, again, talking about the others, in their 1.5 room apartment, and so found myself a clean attic room, the sort to be found in all small or big English hotels. We passed our spare time listening to concerts in Hyde Park. Yes. And then we move on to her columns. And it's very interesting. İngiltere ve İngilizler, England and English. So Akşam newspaper wanted her to write these because it's 1936, is it? Yeah, 39. Apparently, and again, I'm not a historian, England and Turkey had just signed a treaty, which I guess kind of put Turkey on the Allied side in some sense. But it's also very funny. As you can see, the Turks call it Munch, it's not the English channel. So it's the Munch Sea. So this is how the newspaper is advertising these columns. Dostlarımız olan İngilizleri iyi tanımayız. So we do not know our friends, the English very well. So the newspaper is saying that's why we asked Halide, who knows this nation, to tell us what they're like.
Was it published in Izmir Akşam at the time, or was it being published in Istanbul?
Istanbul, so far as I'm aware, because I got it, yes.
Not Izmir paper. Okay.
Yes, I got it from the Istanbul University Library. Oh, I thought I had there we go. So this is the introduction. Again, these are my translations, I'm sorry. So it's got, now I didn't say Munch here, so it's crossing the channel. So, I mean, she's making fun of our friends, the English. So the newspaper is saying our friends, the English, and then Halide is saying, like, I do not know if we're shoulder buddies or fellow travelers or whatever. Like, I'm not quite sure if the English are our friends or whatever, but I believe we need to know them in any case. That is why I want to share what I know about England and the English with my fellow citizens. 30 years ago, when the state of England was for the regressive forces in Turkey, meaning, of course, they were sort of speaking to the Istanbul government or the Sultan and not the Ankara government. The intellectuals of England wanted to get in touch with progressive writers in Turkey whose views they had read in the Turkish papers. So kind of explaining how she herself got to be invited to England. And I went to England on the invitation of one of their number. Right, so these are the 15 columns that she writes, sort of crossing the channel, the aristocrat and the Anglo-Indian, about everything. So, but yeah, Parliament, the mother of parliaments, the Parliament and its members, parties. So 3 articles on the parties. Okay, so I'm going to look at a few. So Parliament and its members. I'm going to read. So the Englishman is a creature that is much attached to reality. He changes his position, even his view, according to necessity. One can say that there is no other nation that has applied this principle of Islamic law, which usually just stays in theory, that says the judgments change with the change of time. So I find this fascinating because we're in 1939, and of course, Islamic law is outlawed in Turkey, and she still has that kind of capacity to make a reference to Islamic law. And again, I think this is one of the points that she clashed with Atatürk with, and she was against the hat law, for instance. So she's very adamant in keeping to sort of aspects of sort of Islamic culture that she finds is right. And it's very interesting that she's connecting it to the British system here. Right, so the British instinct against radicalism. So, I think this is the one in which she talks about Nevinson. She says, and what was particularly English about the situation was that despite the fact that there were many men who thought, spoke, and fought the war of opinions in England, England managed its social evolution without revolution. And so this is like a convention that, you know, the France has all the revolutions, but, you know, England never had one. So she's kind of on that train. For you may choose to attribute this to him not wanting to rock the boat or his conservatism. The Englishman doesn't like radicalism. An MP and journalist by the name of Aubrey Herbert, who had been inimical to the Turks at the start of the war, but supported the Turkish side towards its end, cites the British instinct against radicalism as one of the reasons why they were so against the Young Turk Revolution. So this is, this is what she's talking about, which is, England supporting the regressive forces in Turkey when the Young Turks were trying to make the revolution. Yes. So Roger Fry, she meets, of course, through Isabel Fry. She meets Roger Fry. And it's always fascinating to wonder, how many of the Bloomsbury group that she actually met. Did she even meet Virginia Woolf, maybe? So people have been, it's like this black hole you go into. People have been speculating about this because I think both in their memoirs, both in Virginia Woolf and Halide, they want to go and listen to James Joyce at the Pen Club, but he never shows up or something like that. There's like this urban legend that we have to look into. Yes. So the guest who came after dinner, so she's like Isabel Fry's. The guest who came after dinner was someone altogether different, painter and art critic Roger Fry. I had seen his pictures on the walls of the room because he was the brother of my hostess. Roger Fry was a prime example of the English intellectual type that objected to things that were particularly English in everything, and not just to do with things that related to the Victorian period. It was clear he liked France better than England. So yes, I think we all know people like this. They're the anti-Brexit people. Right, and then we have Oxford. Just like a map, so I don't have a direct quote, but she's very impressed by the black gown clad scholars. And then she says, regardless of what profession the students may end up pursuing, the one characteristic that those who have passed through these halls gain is that of gentlemen. And she also talks about women's efforts to get educated at the university. Right, and she even does sort of like this thing on Cockney, ham and eggs.
That's incredible.
I know. Yes, because she's a linguist. She's always listening to.
Fantastic.
Yeah. It's absolutely wonderful. What else? I think this is the last one. Sort of to round off what she felt about England and actually what she felt about writing about England, she says, I have lived long enough to understand that it is wrong to say of a nation or even an individual, it is in their nature to do this or that. I have experienced much, and I have tried to judge what I saw not according to my heart's desire, but to what they were in themselves. That is why I do not make any conjectures about the English, like after having written 15 columns. Still, if we should try to single out the one value that all of Englishness would think worth defending, including a couple of sincere English communists whom I got to know well, liberals, conservatives, socialists, in short, English people of all hues, it would have to be what they call the liberty of the individual, circumscribed though it may be. So, it's like a saying something nice about the English in the end. And maybe just to close it off, so she wrote that in 39, and then just I talked about this a little. So she founded the English literature department, the Shakespeare translations, and also she has a really curious, very interesting play called Masks for Souls, and it has all these very interesting characters, lots of Shakespearean references, and I think I'll end it here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Nagihan. That was a truly wonderful expose of Halide Edib, a real tour de force, I think. So fascinating. I love the reference to Cockney, I must say. I wonder if she would have tried to pronounce it herself. Which would have
be really interesting, yes.
Ham and eggs.
Yes.
Incredible. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a short question and answer session. I believe we're towards the end, aren't we? But we have a bit more time.
We've got half an hour.
Okay, fantastic. We have more time than I thought. So brilliant. In which case, we have half an hour. I'm going to kick off with one of my own questions, if you don't mind. It's more of a sort of comment with a question attached to it. So you talked about this ambiguous relationship between Halide and the English, and I think you kind of described what you meant by that at the end, where it's not that she it wasn't an ambiguous relationship so much as a kind of non-relationship. She understands the good and the bad, and she
Yes.
takes all of it as part of this, one thing. So the question I have is, did her early experiences meeting certain intellectual figures, particularly of the liberal side of politics, condition some of her thinking about the future of Turkey? Because she was a famous believer in Turanism and
but I would say, I mean, she has periods.
Yes.
Like all later Ottoman intellectuals. I mean,
yes,
she starts off as an Ottomanist, and
Yes.
when seeing that doesn't work, she becomes a Turanist.
she follows the Young Turks, and
Exactly.
then she follows absolutely. But is there any way that her interactions?
Again?
I don't remember she's been to.
She even has a novel called New Turan.
Really?
Yes, Yeni Turan.
Criticizes, they're very strong.
Yeah, but
Eventually she does, yes.
but I mean, she has this book called a novel called New Turan, but of course she's not like a classical Turanist.
No.
So in her sort of Turanist view is more like sort of bypassing almost like the Ottomans and going back to the Selçuks and being more Anatolian.
Yeah.
Her Turanism is more like Anatolianism, but she is borrowing from Turan. It's a fascinating novel, New Turan. I wonder if it's available in English. I doubt it.
I don't. Yeah, she wrote it quite early on as well. It was 1912, I think.
Yes.
She wrote it, so it's quite early on. I wonder. She wrote it in London as well. That's why I'm asking the question. And I wonder whether some of her interactions with these liberal intellectuals, so you mentioned Isabel Fry.
Yeah.
She's reputed to have seen John Dillon, the great Irish nationalist
Yeah.
speaker in Parliament, in 1912 as well. Did that colour her own politics in any way?
I mean, I can only go on what she says herself, but
Yes.
as I said, in her columns in 1939, she has 3 articles on the Parliament, and
Yes.
you can sense that, you know, she's praising the Magna Carta, sort of
Yes.
all these sort of different parties in the Parliament, and of course at the time there's like a one-party governing style in Ankara, and she's almost kind of gesturing towards, wouldn't it be nice
Yes.
if we also had this?
Multi-party.
Yes, multi-party system in Ankara as well. So definitely, and I think she's using these columns to kind of point to that.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think we'll take some questions from the room, and then we'll go to the people on Zoom. So perhaps yes.
You mentioned obviously everything, all her connections with the UK up until the point when she came back to Turkey.
Mhm.
I'm wondering what from that period onwards her relationship.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I maybe need to look more into that. But I mean, for my own purposes, I was looking at how she continues that kind of cultural translation as it was. So she starts with these newspaper columns, and then she even writes a history of English literature. So she's constantly sort of thinking about presenting, so almost introducing the English to the Turkish public. And it's very interesting when you read, and again, it's in the İpek Çalışlar biography, she was really encouraging sort of the daughters and sons of her friends to enroll in the English literature department so that, you know, the English are better known in Turkey. But yeah, what her connection was.
If you want to stop sharing, so we can
Sure,
see
yeah.
you fully, that's
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Escape, and then Zoom.
Yes.
Um,
If you press
if you stop share, yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
Oh, there you
I
are.
can see myself. Fantastic.
Brilliant.
Great.
But yeah, I should look more into that, like with whether that correspondence also continued. Yeah.
So I'm curious about these Hampstead addresses, where they are, and how did she find them? Who found them for her? You know, do you have any about it?
To be honest, I don't know how she found them, but it must have been through, again, because first time she comes, she stays with Isabel Fry, so she must have found it through
Yes.
that connection. I should have noted it down. It's in the İpek Çalışlar book. We know the address. And I remember looking it up actually on Google Maps.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it. South of Park.
Yes, there you go.
Tell her now.
South.
They have it up in that.
Start your car.
Yeah, we need to galvanize.
Yes.
Council.
So how long she was here?
Good question. I'm not very good with dates, but probably from 1922 to 1926.
1920 to 1926, so.
No,
because
no,
there's-
sorry, 1924 to 1926, sorry.
Mm.
Yes.
Because
but
then she went to the
back-
US.
Yes, yes, so it's part of the whole big, long exile.
Exactly.
So she came back, yes, and in 1910, she was in completely different place.
Yes, she was in London and then the Chiltern Hills,
Yes.
where she
Chiltern.
visited
Buckinghamshire.
Okay.
Buckinghamshire, yes.
I see.
With his
And
own
how
farm.
did she stay then, you know?
Again, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not quite clear. Again, I studied the Chiltern biography quite closely. I cannot work out the chronology. Actually, I was speaking to other people who work in Halide Edib, and we're saying, you know, it's so difficult to work out the chronology of where she was or when she was. It's almost always kind of like approximate.
Yes.
Yes,
Fascinating.
I myself, I'm really, I love her English. It's
Yes.
very different. It's
Yeah.
very different than an English person who speaks English, but also it's very different in every which way. So it's her train of thought and way of thinking. But as she was growing up, I think originally she also had a Greek
Yes.
nanny. So she grew up double language, Turkish
Yes.
and Greek in this, and I sort of felt like,
Yeah.
for example, I would interpret her Olympian god
Yeah.
command
Okay.
as a person who grew up in a colonial empire herself. So therefore, she has very similar way of thinking, not because she later was educated by English, but similar colonial way of looking at the Anatolian history and appropriating the colonial ways of that culture,
I would,
Greek culture, let's put it that way. So I sort of think
yes.
the resemblance between the Greek
Okay, but I
cultural
doubt.
interpretation.
Okay,
and
again.
appropriation is very much like the British, but it's an Ottoman colonial thinking that way, you know what I mean?
Okay, I see, yes, but I doubt if the Greek nanny was using that kind of language, because
Yes.
when I mean, I don't think the Greek nanny was talking about Olympian gods, they're more like sort of folk songs, or maybe
Yes,
hymns,
the way
more like
that-
Koine than ancient Greek.
But when you grew up in that culture and geography.
Yeah, then you would
and-
have
and
that
when
kind of
you're a
interest.
colonial
Yes.
there as well, you have that consciousness, so
Yeah.
you take appropriation differently.
Yeah.
And there is this similarity I find there. And her Shakespeare analysis, unbelievable, unbelievable
Yeah.
analysis. Zola and Shakespeare, she does an amazing, so in answer to your question though, her main problem was, she was a soldier, she fought in the independence war, she was on ship,
Mhm.
corporal. So
I don't know.
so she then hated war. And
Mm.
she really saw, there's an amazing description of a dead Turkish and Greek soldier hugging each other in the field. And it's really, there are amazing descriptions, the way she wrote about it, and amazing, it's really, I mean, it gives me goosebumps thinking about it now. She hated war, she just was turned into a world citizen at the end. And therefore, she just basically simply said the war was against humans and inhuman. And she lost her will of living for a long while. She went into terrible depression. But there, she considered the independence war and the follow-up as a revolution, which was a revolution. And everything after that followed as revolution happened very quickly. So she keeps saying, this is like Jacobin French Revolution, and things are happening very quickly, you know, change the alphabet, change this, change that, change, you know. And when all those things happened, which was basically the time of revolutions and the world followed with fascism afterwards.
Yeah.
There she ended up being anti of those things, and their life was threatened and they had to come out.
And yeah, going back to her English commentary, and again, this Masks of Souls, and I think she also mentions it in one of the columns, her analysis of Shakespeare is really interesting. She talks about Falstaff. And then she says, you know, in Turkish culture, she was like this comparator, which I really value. She said, you know, Falstaff is more or less like Nasreddin Hoca. And then actually she has in Master Soul Shakespeare, like it's a very kind of futuristic and absurdist play. So she has Nasreddin Hoca and Shakespeare meet one another as well. So, I mean, you really feel whenever you read that she felt confident and comfortable in both cultures. And again, it's kind of goes back to our understanding of, you know, feeling equal feeling equal to Ataturk, feeling equal to English intellectuals. So it's a very, I think, rare, but a very short period of time in sort of where Turkish intellectuals, particularly sort of this late Ottoman Turkish intellectuals, really felt equal to European intellectuals.
Brilliant. Do we have any more questions from the in-person cast?
Never answered.
What about
Without us.
what about online? Do we have anyone online who'd like to ask a question? Perhaps you could just simply unmute yourself and jump in.
Hello, firstly, thank you so much. You've really covered quite a lot of area, and congratulations, thoroughly enjoyed it. One of your questions about the conflict of the marrying with the Turkish traditions and also push forward the Westernization ideology at the time. I thought also, you will know better than me, that through her literature, I think we see her convey this using the vehicle of literature through her. You reminded me of the Vurun Kahpeye, where we have Aliye, sort of the ideal heroine, the feminist, fearless, and then in the Sinekli Bakkal we have Rabia, who is still holding on to the tradition, the religion, the customs more strongly, and managing to combine both. And I think that was very clever of her at the time, because of, and also through her literature, we also see that her use of language, removing a lot of difficult words, in terms of making it plain language and simpler, so that the literary population could access it more easily, and obviously she could have greater influence. So that it did remind me of also, obviously, what a great role model she was as a very
and not enough talked about, I would say.
No, I agree. I think also it changed the path of the literary innovators from that point on. If we look at Yakup Kadri and so forth, where the women at the forefront of the stories rather than the background, I think, I can't think instantly, but those are the sort of
I think, interestingly, I think Yakup Kadri and she had like a funny falling out, because Yakup Kadri also wanted to name a novel Ateşten Gömlek, but she stole the title.
Yes. Oh, yes. But thank you again, and I just think the further on after that, I think we have also through her literature, we have greater use of realism in stories, and use of the vernacular language, and all kinds of changes were kind of being pushed forward. And I think she was a pioneer in that sense, from what she was learning and embracing, as well as transforming it in through her literature. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think there's an article, if not a novel, I mean, if not a book, to be written about sort of comparing the language she uses in the 39 columns, and you can. I definitely need to write something about it. The language she uses, I mean, you have very kind of Turkish words, and she's still hanging on to the Ottoman ones. It's a very strange kind of mishmash. It will be so interesting to compare her language in 1939 to novels she's written in 1922, just to see how Turkish language itself changed within her work.
Yes. That would, thank you.
It is actually.
I would like to read that.
Okay, all right, that's it.
And may I just add your definition of because it is hard to define her and pigeonhole her. I think your cosmopolitan Ottoman was just spot on.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant. So we have a
James.
hand raised. Yes, James. James has a hand raised.
Hi there. I'm a bit interested to hear a little bit more about the Hampstead thing. First of all, just on the address, I heard somebody in the background in the room mention Southall Park Gardens. Did somebody mention
Yes.
that? Because
Yes.
I mean, as somebody who's brought up in Hampstead, the only street that meets the description in the letter is actually Southall Park, which Southall Park Gardens is the middle of the
So I'm referring to Professor Suheila.
Okay.
I can't hear this person, whoever's speaking.
Sorry, so he's quoting from another scholar of Halide who's written about
And again
Yeah.
from Boğaziçi.
Yeah.
Boğaziçi University.
I mean,
Okay.
they're two sides of the same street, Southall Park
Yeah,
Gardens
okay.
and Southall Park. And the Southall Park side backs onto the lakes, and the other
I mean, yeah.
one, you look across the street, it's possible she could have seen the lakes through the other side of the street.
I mean, we definitely have the house number and everything.
Yes,
in-
it's
in
number
the-
5, South Hill
Yeah.
Mansions, South Hill Park.
Yeah, Southall
Anyway.
Park, not the Southall Park Gardens, yeah. Southall Park, yeah. Because
Okay.
because it's the only street that meets the, looking over the lakes with a half basement and sees spires in the background. That would be the only one that's there. And then I'm curious to hear more about who she knew in Hampstead. I mean, you mentioned the Fries. I mean, you haven't really put her in the context of
Because
kind of
she,
the
I mean, this
Hampstead
is the
radical tradition.
exactly, yeah, because she doesn't talk about it much herself. This is the problem.
I mean, there's lots and lots of memoirs, Hampstead memoirs. I mean, a lot,
Yeah,
more than your
we have
average
to read them
neighborhood.
to see whether Halide appears in any of them.
Yeah.
But I get the sense that they weren't really socializing all that much the way Ralph Orbay talks about it, because they were short on money.
But she writes herself, St. Bernard.
Yes. But I mean, not in
very,
Hampstead
very,
itself. I mean, she knew the kind of intelligentsia, but I don't think like she.
But Bernard Shaw lived across the street in Fitzroy Square from Roger Fry's studio, right? So it's not, I mean, it's a very small world, that world.
I know. I wish there were records of these things, but she
There's a
hasn't
census.
said
You should
anything.
be able to look in the
Actually,
census where people are, right?
Yes.
Theater groups and stuff like that. She
Yeah.
writes it. I forgot it now.
Yes.
But I mean, you had the Fabian movement, you had the Quakers, which
Yes.
the Fries were part of. You had the suffragettes.
Yeah, it will be so interesting to map that out. Who she could have. Tuncay, God, I can't remember his name. He has a good book in which he talks about this kind of late Ottoman early Republican figures and their kind of circles. Tuncay Birkan, I think, yes. And I can't remember exactly what he says, but he's also
And
trying
you also
to work
had
out.
a lot of other kind of let's say colonial exiles, right? I mean, people like her. There were a lot of other people like that in Hampstead from different places.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's the one line she writes to Florence Billings saying, oh, and Adnan is feeling, this revolutionary fever in Hampstead, but she doesn't really, well, at least, because I read the letter in the İpek Çalışlay biography. I don't know whether if the letter is longer or there are other letters to Florence Billings in which she kind of talks more about Hampstead. Maybe that's the correspondence one needs to look at.
Yes, I think İpek's book is pretty much more. It's much longer than the censored ones, but I don't think it's complete.
Yeah.
They're still censored.
Yes.
So, but I don't know about the particular letter, but
Yeah.
yeah, as Mustafa Kemal parts.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Do we have any more questions from the online audience? Would anyone else like to jump in? Would anyone else here like to jump in? Well, I'm sure we will continue the
Well, I mean,
conversation.
she's a fascinating, fascinating character.
She really is.
And
Yes,
it's
Read her.
difficult for us today,
Yes.
with our nationalistic minds, to
Yes.
get that
yes,
moment.
yes.
But I mean, of course, in England, I think more easy to understand it.
Yes.
But for rest of the world, it's very difficult.
It's kind of, there's the national, I mean, us thinking in a nationalistic manner, but also thinking of this kind of religious secular divide now, which she didn't really recognize at all. So it's a really, she's super refreshing, and that's why she should be, I think, read more
For
often.
example, that picture of the meeting in Istanbul, the famous, you always see Fezis, man.
Yes.
But actually, if you move the camera,
Yes.
there's a film of it. There is a masses of women there.
Mhm,
Really,
Yes.
I mean, more than men.
mhm.
There were
Mhm.
so many women
Yes.
in that meeting.
Apparently,
It's
Suat
just-
Dervish was also there.
She was there, yes.
Yes, and
So it's a very different time to understand.
but also when you read her, again, this is from Picture Schlar's book, I think. She's describing some of the lectures that she was giving already before the Republic in the
Yeah.
university, and then she's talking about male and female students together.
Mhm.
And there's this beautiful line in one of her New York Times interviews, in which she says, you know, oh yes, I met the American students. They're as clever as the ones I have in Istanbul. So she's like, so these Americans, okay, they're just as good, but you know, not any better than the students I have. So again, this idea that the equality, the idea of equality is super entrenched in her thinking, I think.
Mhm. Brilliant. Well, I think it's a fascinating conversation.
Didn't the New York Times or the time when first they published her biography, they said the woman behind Mustafa Kemal Atatürk.
Something like that, maybe like a
the
tagline, yes.
Yeah. That was-
But why wasn't the British press interested in her?
This is a very good question. And again, maybe it's just that, again, New York Times articles are easier to find. It would be interesting to kind of search for her in the Times, for instance. But, you know, I've never,
She hasn't been in contact, she's been more with, I'm wondering, was that a source of income as well? Like, could she be like, you know, was she writing articles for the New York Times or?
It wasn't. It's all, there are interviews, there's a review of her novel.
No articles.
Yeah.
Well, you should search the Guardian, not the Times, for that kind of
Okay.
person.
Yeah, let's try that.
The Manchester Guardian.
Yeah, that's what you should search.
Amazing. For example, there's a description of her with two other colonels sitting down and they're getting these guns in their hands.
Yeah.
And they're just analyzing the revolvers or pistols. She is very, very
Methodical,
educated.
yes.
She knows anything about the weapons as well. She's a good shooter, she's
Yeah.
a good writer, she rides horses amazingly,
Yeah.
etc. But then there is the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks are coming, and so there is this meeting. And they come in and they see these three Turkish soldiers, one of them is a woman, playing with guns on the table with their, and they're like, oh dear, now what are we gonna do? It's like, this is some sort of not a very, very safe area, so. So there is all these figures in Anatolia at the time, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and other nations,
Yes.
Indians, Pakistanis, incredible time. I mean, it's really incredible, and her memoirs are an amazing picture of that time,
Yes.
really amazing.
I read the first chapter of her memoirs, which I found completely fascinating because she was talking about her childhood.
Oh, yes.
And the how vivid her memory was of her childhood was astonishing.
Yes.
And she spoke about this cosmopolitan surrounding in Üsküdar.
But I think, I mean, also that,
Armenian and Greek neighbors, and
Yeah.
she didn't like her cook very much. Rasim, her cook. This is
I
something
don't
that's-
remember.
that stuck with me. She
I-
preferred her Greek nanny to her Turkish
Yeah.
cook, and she made a point of mentioning that. which
Yeah,
found
I remember
very
the
interesting. Yeah.
African slave girl.
Yes.
Yes.
It's a lovely anecdote because
Mm.
you know, when the girl sort of learns Turkish, what she says is, you know, just as, you know, white people think that, you know, the Africans are cannibals, she says, I thought the white people were cannibals and you were gonna eat me. And it's such such a good kind of writing back. Yeah, anyway, everybody read her.
Well, we certainly will. It's been a really wonderful discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
You're very
Nagihan.
welcome.
I think we're going to have to continue the conversation.
Yes.
After the online audience sadly will leave us, I'm sure we will have a fruitful discussion. But thank you so much, Nagihan.
You're very
Have a round of applause.